Hey everybody! So today we're going to talk about aperture. So aperture is the opening in a lens. It is how large or how small the opening actually is. So let me show you what I mean, and I'm going to show you with one of my film lenses. Now this lens already has some issues with it, so that's why I'm doing this. I do not recommend that you take your lens off your camera and start messing around with it like this, because you can introduce dirt and hair and dust into your camera and lens by doing this. So again, I do not recommend you do this, but I do want to show you what exactly it is. So there, you can see that little hole back there, and all right, and now it's gotten larger. Come on, let me get it right. There we go, that's a good spot. So there's a small aperture, and there's a large aperture. So it is, you know, it's a physical thing that happens within a lens. All right, let me get a cap back on this real quick. And moving forward. So now that you know that where the aperture actually is, let's talk a little bit more about it. So the aperture controls the depth of field, or how much of a photo can be in focus. So if you remember from the photos we looked at in the intro video, there was the two photos of me, and one of them had a blurry background, and one of them had a background that was a little bit more clear. Now, the camera didn't move, the focus point didn't move. All that changed for that photo was the aperture, which changed the depth of field, or how much of the photo was able to be in focus. Now, this also controls how much light is coming into the camera. Let's see. The aperture setting is also called an f-stop. Let's see, come on. All right. The aperture setting is also called an f-stop. So if you're using an aperture setting of 2, you would say f2. And when you hear photographers talk about these things, you know, I'm at f5.6, f22, f16, they're talking about the aperture setting. Larger openings have a smaller f-stop number. So this is the part that kind of confuses people. I'm not really going to go into the reasons why they decided to do that, but it's just something that you kind of learn to live with, that you'll basically start to memorize. The more and more you do it, definitely helps out. So large openings have a smaller f-stop number. For example, f1.4, that would be a large opening, whereas f16 would be a small opening. So like I said, we're just going to keep practicing this stuff and you'll get it. Okay, so let's talk about depth of field a little bit more. That's one of the big creative decisions we have with aperture, right? So depth of field is the distance between the nearest and the furthest objects that can be in focus in a camera. So here in this example, we have a photographer. Here's the focus distance, here's the focus point, and here is the depth of field. So only the area from here to here is able to be in focus. So if this were the case, they would be using a large aperture to create this narrow depth of field. Okay, and in the bottom example, we have the photographer in the same place. The focus distance and focus point are the same, but we have a large depth of field. We have a larger area that can be in focus in the photo. So now, if this were the case here, you know, this animal looks like maybe a bear or something. The bear's face and front paws looks like it would be in focus, but anything in front of it or behind it would be blurred out. Where in this case, where we have a large depth of field that's caused by a small aperture, we have a lot more area that would be able to be in focus. So we'd be able to get the trees in front, the actual bear, along with the mountains behind the bear in focus as well. If you would like to, I did include a link to where I got this graphic from. It's actually a pretty good blog post about depth of field, and it shows more examples. So if you'd like to check that out now, feel free to come to my lecture page and click there. Alright, so A larger opening is going to create less depth of field. And you're going to hear this referred to as small, shallow, or narrow depth of field. And a smaller opening is going to create more depth of field. So you may hear this referred to as large depth of field or deep depth of field. Now this next chart kind of combines the idea of depth of field and how much light is being let into the camera all together. So we have the size of the aperture here, we have the f-stop number here, and then we have a representation of the depth of field here. So in this case we have f1.4, which is a large depth of field, and we have a shallow depth of field. I'm sorry, which is a large aperture, and this is a shallow depth of field. Oh my goodness, I hope I don't flub on that too much for you guys. I'm sorry. Alright, so now we have on the other extreme, here's f32. It has a small opening, right? But we have a really deep depth of field. So I guess maybe a good way to remember the depth of field part would be the larger the number, the more depth of field. But also remember that the larger the number, the less light is being let in because that opening is smaller. Alright. Now, aperture also controls how much light is coming in, so this one's a little easier. Small aperture, less light. Large aperture, more light. Let me show you real quick on this camerasim.com, and you can come to this lecture and click on this link also, and it'll open up for you. What I mean by more and less light. So this is a really cool camera simulator that you can play with. And we're going to play with this more in the next week's lecture, but I just wanted to show you really quick, that changing the aperture really does affect how much or how less light is coming in. So first off, I'm going to go ahead and leave most of these settings the same. I am going to click here on manual. These are some different camera modes that we're going to talk about a little more later, but let's click on manual. I'm going to leave the ISO the same. I'm going to leave the shutter speed the same. All I'm going to change is the aperture. So right now I'm going to snap a photo and it looks good. It's nice and even. The exposure is good. There's not any areas that are too light or blown out. There's not any areas that are too dark. So yay, we're doing good so far. Now let's say I wanted to open up my aperture. Now when I say open up my aperture, I mean make my aperture larger. So if I'm going to make my aperture larger, I'm going to go down this way to a smaller f-stop number, because an f2.8 is a small number, but it's a larger opening. And what else does a larger opening create? It is less depth of field. So let's take a photo. Okay, wow, that is way overexposed. We have, no details at all in the light areas. We're letting in way too much light for a good exposure. And again, I'm not going to change any other setting. I'm just going to change the aperture. And I'm going to take it to the other extreme. On here, it's f22. f22 is a small aperture, but you do have more depth of field. And, oh, that one actually turned out okay. Wait a minute, what did I do wrong here? Oh. Did it reset my settings? Oh, I clicked and then clicked away. Okay, there we go. Come on, stay, f22. Okay, snap photo. Alright, so f22, smaller opening, letting in less light, so we have a photo that's too dark. Alright, so let's get back to it now. Let me make something clear though. f22 doesn't automatically mean that you're going to have a dark photo. What happens with these settings is that it's like a balance, but there's 3 balancing things. So if you've ever seen like a little, icon of a little balancing a scale, it's like a 3-sided scale. When you change one, you have to change another to balance the light. So I can get a good exposure at f22, f20, f9, f2.8. I can get a good exposure at all of these different f-stops. I would just have to change some of the other settings to balance the exposure. But that's what we're going to be talking about extensively with next week. For now, I just wanted to show you that changing an aperture does let either less light or more light in. Alright, let's get back to the lecture page. And we're going to look at another chart. Now this one is kind of nice. Maybe you might want to come to this page and save it to your phone. But it kind of lays out all of the different little graph guide things that we've looked at into one. So here I have my aperture. I have a large opening. I have f1.4 and a shallow depth of field. So if this was the case and this is where the focus point was, then this is the photo you would end up with. The flowers would be nice and in focus, but the bear and the mountains would not be within that area that can be in focus. Okay, and going all the way down to f16. So f16 we have a small opening. f16 we have a larger depth of field, and so they're focused here, but because of that large depth of field we have the flowers and the bear and the mountains all nice and in focus. Alright, so again, I recommend that, this might be a handy thing to save to your phone so you can kind of look at it when you're trying to think about this stuff. Next we're going to be talking about shutter speed.